What would you do if everyone you loved was dying, one after another, and the only explanation that made sense was impossible? What if your community, your neighbors, your friends, the people you prayed with every Sunday, told you that your own dead daughter was feeding on your living son? That to save him, you'd have to dig her up and burn her heart. Welcome to this journey into one of the most documented cases of vampire panic in American history. But before we descend into the winter graveyards of New England, I need you to ask yourself, where is the line between love and desecration? Between desperate hope and violation? Tell us where you're watching from right now and whether you believe grief can excuse the unthinkable, because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about how far a parent will go to save their child, and what we're willing to destroy in the name of salvation. This episode discusses real historical events involving death from tuberculosis, exhumation of human remains, and the desecration of a young woman's body. We present these accounts with profound respect for Mercy Brown and her family, who suffered unimaginable loss. This is not entertainment. This is testimony to how fear can transform grief into horror. In the town records of Exeter, Rhode Island, there exists a newspaper clipping from the Providence Journal dated March 21, 1892, with a headline that reads, "Exhumed Bodies Testing a Horrible Superstition." The article describes in clinical detail how the townspeople of a small New England village dug up 3 corpses from their family tomb, searching for signs of vampirism. The last body they examined belonged to a 19-year-old girl named Mercy Lena Brown. What they found in her coffin, and what they did next, would make international headlines and mark the last known vampire ritual performed in the United States. We're about to delve into a mystery that haunts the border between folk medicine and mass hysteria, where one family's tragedy triggered a public exhumation so disturbing that it shocked a nation already familiar with death. This isn't just a story about superstition. This is a question about how thin the line is between rational people and a mob convinced they're battling the supernatural. It was the year 1892. America was transforming electricity lighting city streets, railroads connecting the coasts, the modern world emerging from the Industrial Revolution's fire and smoke. But in the remote farming villages of rural Rhode Island, another kind of consumption was taking hold, one far older than factories, one that fed on the living and seemed to spread from the dead. And in one small family, the Browns of Exeter, that consumption was about to transform grief into something far more terrible, a desperate ritual that would disturb the dead and mark the living forever. There's something you need to understand about southern Rhode Island in the 1880s, something in the land itself that seems to breed darkness. Not the darkness of crime or violence, but the slow, creeping darkness of inevitability. The villages there sit in shallow valleys where fog pools like standing water, where the thin, rocky soil barely sustains the small farms that dot the landscape, where winter comes early and stays late, and where the sun, even at its height, seems distant and cold. Exeter was, and remains, one of the smallest of these villages. In 1892, fewer than 2,000 souls called it home. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where generations were buried in the same small cemetery, where the same families had worked the same stubborn land since colonial times. The Browns were one such family. George Brown owned a modest farm on the outskirts of town, nothing grand, just enough land to keep his family fed and a small herd of cattle that he tended with the quiet dedication of a man who expected nothing from life but hard work and harder winters. The Brown farmhouse stood, and you can still find its foundation if you know where to look, at the end of a dirt road that became impassable in the wet season. A simple structure, wood, framed, 2 stories, with a kitchen that never seemed quite warm enough and bedrooms that never seemed quite separate enough from the cold that seeped through the walls. Here, George lived with his wife, Mary Eliza, and their children, Mary Olive, the eldest daughter, sensible and serious at 20, Edwin, the only son, 19, and already showing his father's solid build and quiet temperament, and the youngest, Mercy Lena, whose name would soon be spoken in whispers across 2 continents. Mercy, the name itself carries a cruel irony that history hasn't overlooked. Born in 1873, she was by all accounts an ordinary girl, not exceptionally beautiful, not particularly remarkable, simply a farmer's daughter with brown hair and a quick smile, who helped her mother with the washing and the cooking, who attended the Baptist church every Sunday, who had perhaps dreamed of a future beyond the rocky fields of Exeter, but had never voiced such dreams aloud. In the photographs that survive, and there is only one confirmed image of her, she stares at the camera with an expression that's hard to read. Some see sadness there, others see resignation, but that photograph was taken after everything, when Mercy already knew what was growing in her lungs. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened in March of 1892, we need to go back to December of 1883, when death first walked into the Brown farmhouse and never truly left. Consumption, that's what they called it then, a name that perfectly captured the disease's nature. It consumed. It ate away at you from the inside, slowly, relentlessly, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell and rattling breath. Today we call it tuberculosis, caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, a bacterium so perfectly evolved to infect human lungs that it has killed more people than any other infectious disease in human history. But in 1883, no one knew about bacteria. No one understood contagion. All they knew was that consumption ran in families, that it seemed to pass from the dead to the living, and that once it entered a household, it rarely left until everyone was gone. Mary Eliza Brown began coughing in the late autumn of 1883. At first, it seemed like nothing. A cold, perhaps, or the normal irritation that came from breathing the smoke of the kitchen fire. But the cough persisted. Through November, through December, deepening from a dry hack to something wetter, something that brought up phlegm flecked with pink, then red, then the unmistakable crimson of blood. By January, she was bedridden. Imagine George Brown watching his wife waste away in their unheated bedroom, watching her skin become translucent as parchment, her eyes growing huge in her shrinking face, her body shaking with chills one moment and burning with fever the next. The children would have heard her coughing through the thin walls, that distinctive consumptive cough that sounds like something breaking, like something tearing deep in the chest. The doctor came, of course. Doctors in rural Rhode Island in 1883 had little to offer consumptives except morphine for the pain and advice that everyone already knew: fresh air, good food, rest. None of which could stop the inevitable. Mary Eliza Brown died on December 8, 1883. She was 36 years old. In the death records, her cause of death is listed simply as consumption, a diagnosis so common it barely warranted specifics. They buried her in the family plot at the Chestnut Hill Cemetery, less than a mile from the farmhouse. Winter burials in New England are brutal affairs, the ground frozen solid, the mourners numb with cold that penetrates deeper than grief, the ceremony rushed because standing still in December wind is its own form of torture. George Brown stood at that graveside with his 3 children and watched them lower his wife into the frozen earth. He could not have known that this was just the beginning, that Mary Eliza would not be the last Brown to occupy that plot. That in less than a decade he would stand in this same cemetery and do something that would horrify his neighbors and fascinate historians for over a century. Life continued as it must, even after death. George hired help for the housework, a widow from town who came twice a week to cook and clean. The children took on more responsibilities. Mary Olive, at 20, became the woman of the house, managing her younger siblings, maintaining some semblance of normalcy in rooms that still seemed to echo with their mother's coughing. For 5 years, the Browns lived with their grief, but nothing more. George worked his fields. Edwin helped with the cattle. Mercy grew from child to adolescent to young woman. They attended church. They paid their taxes. They were, by all accounts, an ordinary family managing an ordinary tragedy in the way that farming families had managed such tragedies for generations. But consumption is patient. It can lie dormant for years, hiding in the tissues of the lungs, waiting for the right conditions, stress, malnutrition, another illness, to awaken and begin its work again. And consumption, we now know, is contagious. Every cough from Mary Eliza had expelled millions of bacteria into the air of that small farmhouse. Every shared meal, every embrace, every night sleeping in adjacent rooms had been an opportunity for transmission. The Browns had been living in an infected environment for years, breathing in death with every breath, and none of them knew it. In 1888, Mary Olive began to cough. The sound must have been like a ghost manifesting in the kitchen, that same distinctive hack that had heralded her mother's decline. George would have recognized it immediately. The awful certainty that the disease had returned, that it was happening again, that he was going to lose another child to the same invisible enemy that had taken his wife. The progression was identical, the cough that wouldn't stop, the weight loss, the night sweats that soaked through the bedclothes, the fever that came and went like a tide, the blood, always, eventually, the blood. Mary Olive fought it for nearly 3 months, growing thinner and paler and weaker, while the family watched helplessly. She died on June 6, 1888, at the age of 20. Her death certificate lists the same diagnosis, consumption. Now there were 2 Browns in the family plot, mother and daughter, buried side by side. And George Brown, standing at another winter grave, must have begun to wonder what he had done to deserve this. What sin he had committed that God would punish him by taking his wife and now his eldest child. He could not have known, no one could have known, that in the soil beneath his feet, in the coffins that held his dead, bacteria were still active, still alive in the unique preservative environment of a New England winter burial. He could not have known that in the folklore of rural New England there was an explanation for families that died one after another, an explanation that had nothing to do with God's will and everything to do with the dead feeding on the living. But he was about to learn. Edwin Brown was, by all accounts, a healthy young man, strong from farm work, robust, the kind of son a widowed farmer could depend on. In the spring of 1890, he was 20, 4 years old, and seemed untouched by the disease that had killed his mother and sister. There was talk of him courting a girl from a neighboring farm, talk of him eventually taking over his father's land. Normal talk, future talk, the kind of talk that consumption makes impossible. The cough started in late 1890. At first, Edwin tried to hide it, clearing his throat instead of coughing, turning away from his father when the hacking became unavoidable, making excuses about dust from the fields or smoke from the fire, but you can't hide consumption forever. By early 1891, Edwin was visibly ill. The same weight loss, the same pallor, the same blood-flecked handkerchiefs that he tried to hide but which his father found anyway, stained and crumpled. evidence of a disease that had now claimed 3 members of his family. But Edwin didn't die, not quickly at least. Perhaps he was stronger than his mother and sister. Perhaps the disease progressed more slowly in him. Or perhaps, and this is a darker thought, consumption knew it needed to keep him alive a little longer, needed him breathing and coughing and spreading bacteria through the farmhouse, needed him as a host while it prepared to take the last remaining child. Because in the winter of 1891, Mercy began to cough. She was 19 years old, the last child, the last hope, and she was dying. There's something particularly cruel about dying of consumption in winter. The cold aggravates every symptom, makes the coughing worse, makes breathing an agony, makes the chills that rack the body even more unbearable. Mercy Brown spent her final winter in a bedroom that never warmed above freezing, wrapped in quilts that couldn't stop her shivering, coughing until she vomited, until she brought up blood, until exhaustion finally gave her a few hours of fitful sleep before the cycle began again. We know some details about her last months from neighbors' accounts recorded years later. We know that she stayed cheerful longer than most consumptives, that she insisted on coming downstairs for meals even when she could barely walk, assuring them she was improving even as she grew weaker. We know that George Brown sat with her every night, holding her hand, reading to her from the Bible, praying for a miracle that never came. We know that Mercy Brown died on January 17, 1892, a Tuesday, cold enough that the water in the basin by her bedside had frozen overnight. She was 19 years, 5 months, and 12 days old. The death certificate, filed by Dr. Harold Metcalf, lists cause of death as consumption, 2 months duration, a timeline we now know was inaccurate, that her disease had likely been progressing for longer, but had only become undeniable in those final 2 months. She was buried 2 days later in the family plot at Chestnut Hill Cemetery, in a receiving tomb because the ground was too frozen for a grave. Her body would wait there, in the dark and cold, until spring thaw allowed for proper burial. She would not have to wait that long, because in the farmhouse on that lonely road, Edwin Brown was still alive, still coughing, still dying. And the community of Exeter, watching the Brown family be destroyed 1 member at a time, was beginning to whisper about older explanations, older remedies, older magics that had nothing to do with doctors or medicine, and everything to do with what the dead might be doing to the living. Before we go further, you need to understand something about New England in the late 19th century. This was a landscape haunted by 2 competing worldviews. On the surface, there was Christianity, Baptist churches in every village, prayer meetings, Bible study, the confident assertion that science and progress were illuminating the darkness. But underneath, older and deeper, there was something else. Folk beliefs that had come over with the first settlers, beliefs that predated Christianity itself, beliefs about what happened when the dead didn't stay dead. They didn't call it vampirism, not exactly. The word vampire was foreign, exotic, associated with Eastern European superstition. But the concept was the same, the dead feeding on the living. In New England, they spoke of it more obliquely. They said the dead person was not resting easy. They said the deceased was draining the living relatives. They spoke of exhuming bodies to check for signs of continued life, liquid blood, a ruddy complexion, lack of decomposition, and if those signs were found, of taking specific actions to kill the corpse and break its hold on the living. This wasn't ancient history. This was happening in living memory. Between 1793 and 1892, right up to the year Mercy Brown died, there were at least 17 documented cases of suspected vampire exhumation in New England. In 1817, in Manchester, Vermont, the father of a consumptive patient had the body of the patient's dead brother exhumed, the heart removed and burned, and the ashes mixed with medicine for the living sibling. In 1870, in Jewett City, Connecticut, families in the community exhumed multiple relatives to check for vampirism. In 1890, just 2 years before the Brown case, in West Greenwich, Rhode Island, less than 20 miles from Exeter, a family exhumed their dead daughter to burn her heart. The pattern was always the same: a family afflicted with consumption, one death followed by another and another. The suspicion that the first to die was somehow responsible for the subsequent deaths. The decision to exhume and examine. The ritual burning of the heart or vital organs, the belief sometimes confirmed, sometimes not, that this would cure the living. And the most important detail: this wasn't ignorant peasants performing superstitious rituals in secret. These were ordinary New England families, farmers, churchgoers, taxpayers who believed, truly believed, that they were fighting a supernatural threat with the only weapons available to them. And their communities supported them. Doctors attended the exhumations. Selectmen gave permission. Newspapers reported the events with a mixture of skepticism and understanding. Because here's the truth that makes this story so disturbing. From their perspective, it made sense. Consumption did run in families. One death did seem to cause another. The disease was invisible, mysterious, and always fatal. And in the absence of any medical explanation, any medical treatment, any hope at all, what would you do? What wouldn't you do to save your dying child? We don't know exactly when George Brown first heard the suggestion. Was it at church, from a neighbor who had seen too many Browns buried? Was it from a friend who remembered the West Greenwich case? Or did it come from Edwin himself, desperate and dying, begging his father to try anything, anything at all? What we do know is that by late February of 1892, George Brown was in conversation with the selectmen of Exeter, the town officials, about exhuming the bodies of his wife and daughters. We know this because the selectmen discussed it at their meeting on March 10th and gave their permission. We know that George enlisted the help of Dr. Harold Metcalf, the same doctor who had attended all 3 deaths, to oversee the examination. We know that the date was set for March 17, 1892, exactly 2 months after Mercy's death. And we know that somehow, whether through the selectmen talking, or the doctor, or George himself, word spread through Exeter that the exhumation was going to happen. That on March 17th, the Browns were going to dig up their dead to check for vampirism. The response was not outrage. It was interest, supportive interest. People wanted to witness this. They wanted to help. Because the Brown case had become Exeter's tragedy, and if there was any chance at all, that this ritual might save Edwin Brown, then it was worth trying. On the morning of March 17, 1892, a Thursday, cold but clear, with the last snow melting in patches across the cemetery, a crowd began to gather at Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Contemporary accounts vary on the number. Some say it was a dozen people. Some say it was closer to 50. What's certain is that this was not a secret ritual. This was a community event. The receiving tomb at Chestnut Hill Cemetery was a stone structure built into the side of a hill, essentially a cave reinforced with masonry, where bodies could be stored during winter when frozen ground made burial impossible. When George Brown and his neighbors opened the door that morning, they would have been hit immediately by the smell. Not the smell of decay. It was too cold for that, but the smell of death nonetheless. Stone and damp and something else, something organic and wrong. There were 3 bodies inside: Mary Eliza Brown, dead for 8 years; Mary Olive Brown, dead for nearly 4 years; And Mercy Brown, dead for 2 months. They brought out Mary Eliza's coffin first. When they opened it, and here we're relying on the newspaper accounts published in the days following, particularly the extensive report in the Providence Journal, they found exactly what you'd expect. After 8 years, bones, complete decomposition, nothing that could remotely be considered undead. Mary Olive's coffin was next. 4 years in the tomb had been almost as thorough. Extensive decomposition, some desiccated tissue remaining, but clearly, obviously dead. No liquid blood, no preservation, nothing that suggested continued life. Then they carried out Mercy's coffin. And here is where the story transforms from tragedy into horror, where grief becomes desecration, where desperate hope encounters the reality of a body that hasn't had time to decay. When they opened Mercy's coffin, they found her. Try to imagine what they saw. A body that had been dead for 2 months. 2 months in the freezing cold of a New England winter, in a stone tomb that functioned essentially as a refrigerator. 2 months is not long enough for significant decomposition in those conditions. So when George Brown looked into his daughter's coffin, he saw her. Not as she was when she died. Consumption leaves its marks, the terrible thinness, the sunken eyes, but recognizably her. Still her. The Providence Journal's account is clinical but clear. The body showed little decomposition. When they turned her over, and God help us, they turned her over, they moved her body, they examined her like a specimen. Blood flowed from her mouth and nose. When Dr. Metcalf made an incision to examine her heart, because they were committed to this examination that would either prove or disprove their theory, he found what he described as liquid blood in the heart and liver. To the people gathered at that cemetery, this was proof. This was confirmation of their worst fears and validation of their decision to exhume. Because according to the folklore, according to the belief system they'd grown up with, a corpse that retained liquid blood, that showed minimal decomposition, that bled when moved, that was a corpse. That was still, in some terrible way, alive. That was a vampire. We know better now, of course. We understand that decomposition rates vary wildly depending on temperature, that a body stored at near freezing temperatures can remain relatively preserved for months, that lividity, the settling of blood in a corpse, can create the appearance of liquid blood, even in a thoroughly dead body. We understand that Mercy Brown was not a vampire. She was simply a girl who had died in winter and hadn't had time to decay. But they didn't know that. Killing Edwin. And they believed they knew how to stop it. Dr. Metcalf, a trained physician, a man of science, someone who should have known better, removed Mercy Brown's heart and liver. Right there, in the cemetery, in front of witnesses, he cut into the 19-year-old girl's body and removed her organs. They built a fire on a nearby rock. This detail is confirmed by multiple sources. They built a fire right there in the cemetery, and they burned Mercy Brown's heart and liver to ashes. The smell must have been indescribable. Human tissue burning has a distinctive odor, sweet and terrible and unmistakable. The smoke would have risen over Chestnut Hill, visible from the farmhouses nearby, a signal that the ritual was being performed, that Exeter was fighting back against the force that had taken so many of its children. When the organs had been reduced to ashes, they mixed those ashes with water to create a medicine. And this medicine was given to Edwin Brown to drink. Pause for a moment and consider what we're describing. A father watched his daughter's body be cut open, watched her heart removed, watched it burn, and then gave the ashes to his dying son to drink, believing, truly believing, that this would save him. The news spread quickly. Within days, newspapers across New England were reporting the story. Within weeks, it had reached national attention. The Providence Journal ran the most complete account on March 21st, under the headline Exhumed Bodies, testing a horrible superstition in Rhode Island. The article is fascinating in its tone, skeptical but not entirely condemnatory, presenting the facts while also noting that the belief in vampirism was not uncommon in rural New England. But where the journal was measured, other papers were sensational. The New York World sent a correspondent to Exeter who wrote a lengthy feature describing the barbaric practice and the ignorant villagers. The Philadelphia Record called it ghoulish superstition. Papers as far away as Chicago picked up the story, each adding their own editorial commentary about the backwardness of rural America, the persistence of old-world superstitions, the need for better education. In Exeter itself, reactions were mixed. Some residents defended the Brown family and the town's decision, arguing that they had done what they thought was necessary to save a life. Others were embarrassed, angry that their town was being held up to national mockery, insisting that only a small number of people had actually believed in the vampire theory and that most residents had considered the whole affair distasteful. George Brown retreated from public view. He gave no interviews, issued no statements, simply returned to his farm and his dying son and waited. And Edwin drank the ashes of his sister's heart and continued to die. The vampire cure didn't work. Of course it didn't work. Nothing could have worked because Edwin Brown wasn't being drained by the supernatural. He was being killed by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, against which ashes and folklore had no power whatsoever. He survived 2 more months, 2 months during which he must have known that his sister's body had been desecrated for nothing. 2 months during which the newspapers were still writing about the Rhode Island vampire and making his family a national spectacle. 2 months during which he coughed and weakened and bled, and died exactly the way his mother and sisters had died. Edwin Brown died on May 2, 1892. He was 24 years old. His death certificate lists cause of death as consumption, 18 months duration. He was buried in the family plot at Chestnut Hill Cemetery, next to his mother and sisters, all of them victims of the same disease, none of them vampires, all of them simply dead. George Brown was now alone. His entire family, wife, and 3 children, gone in less than a decade, all to the same disease, all buried in the same small plot of ground. He was 49 years old, and he had nothing left except a farm. He no longer had the heart to work, and a community that was divided about whether he was a grieving father who had done his best or a superstitious fool who had violated his daughter's corpse for nothing. After Edwin's death, something strange happened in Exeter: silence. The story that had been national news for weeks simply faded. The newspapers moved on to other sensations. The out-of-town curiosity seekers stopped coming to gawk at the cemetery, and Exeter itself seemed to collectively decide not to talk about what had happened. George Brown sold his farm in 1890, 2 years after the exhumation, and moved to nearby Green, Rhode Island. He lived there quietly until his death in 1920, at the age of 79. He never remarried. He never spoke publicly about the exhumation. In his later years, neighbors remembered him as a quiet, sad man who kept to himself and who flinched whenever anyone mentioned consumption or coughing. The other participants in the exhumation, the neighbors who had helped dig, the selectmen who had given permission, Dr. Metcalf, who had performed the autopsy, likewise fell silent. There are no interviews, no memoirs, no deathbed confessions. It's as if Exeter collectively decided that the best way to handle what had happened was to forget it had happened at all. But you can't bury something like this and expect it to stay buried. The story persisted in local folklore, whispered about but not discussed openly. Mercy Brown became a legend, her name associated with vampires and curses and supernatural horror, her actual humanity, the fact that she was just a 19-year-old girl who died of tuberculosis, obscured by the sensational nature of what happened to her body after death. Chestnut Hill Cemetery still exists. You can visit it if you want. It's a public cemetery, maintained by the town, accessible to anyone. And if you go there, if you walk through the old section where the Browns are buried, you'll find something interesting. Mercy Brown's grave is the most visited site in the entire cemetery. More visited than the Revolutionary War veterans, more visited than the town founders, more visited than anyone else buried there. Her headstone is modest, a simple granite marker that reads Mercy L., daughter of George T. and Mary E. Brown, died Jan. 17, 1892, age 19 ers, 5 Moss, 12 Das. No mention of vampirism. No acknowledgement of what happened 2 months after her death. Just a daughter's grave, but visitors leave things there. Coins, flowers, notes, offerings. Some leave traditional grave tributes. Others leave things that acknowledge the vampire legend, garlic, wooden stakes, protective symbols. The grave has been vandalized multiple times over the years, the stone damaged by people carving initials or symbols, treating it like a supernatural curiosity rather than a person's final resting place. The receiving tomb where her body was stored, where the exhumation took place, no longer exists. It was demolished at some point in the early 20th century. Whether because it had fallen into disrepair or because the town wanted to erase evidence of what had happened there, no one knows. But the memory persists. Exeter may have wanted to forget, but the world won't let it. Because Mercy Brown's case wasn't just another vampire panic. It was the last one. The last documented case of vampire exhumation in the United States. The final gasp of a belief system that was already dying, killed by the same forces of modernization and scientific understanding that were transforming America. Here's what we know now, what George Brown and his neighbors didn't know and couldn't have known in 1892. Tuberculosis is caused by bacteria. It spreads through the air when infected people cough or sneeze. It is highly contagious in close quarters, which is why it devastated families living in small, poorly ventilated farmhouses where the sick and healthy shared the same air, the same cups, the same beds. The reason consumption ran in families wasn't supernatural, it was epidemiological. Mary Eliza Brown almost certainly infected her children before she died. Mary Olive infected her siblings. Edwin and Mercy infected each other. It was a cascade of disease, not a curse. The liquid blood found in Mercy's heart, lividity and delayed decomposition due to cold storage, the lack of decay. 2 months in near freezing temperatures, the blood flowing from her mouth when they turned her. Post-mortem purge, a normal occurrence when gases build up in a decomposing body and force fluids out through natural orifices. Every sign of vampirism was actually a sign of normal, natural processes that occur in dead bodies under specific conditions. But here's the cruel part. Even if someone had explained all of this to George Brown, even if a bacteriologist from Boston had come to Exeter and given a lecture on Mycobacterium, tuberculosis, and airborne transmission and the actual causes of consumption, it wouldn't have mattered, because there was still no cure. Antibiotics wouldn't be discovered for another 50 years. The only treatments for tuberculosis in 1892 were fresh air, good food, and hope, none of which could save someone in the advanced stages of the disease. So yes, the vampire cure was superstition. It was based on false premises and magical thinking, but the desperation that drove it was real. George Brown wasn't an ignorant peasant. He was a father watching his children die and being offered no help by modern medicine. When folklore offered an explanation and a potential cure, what was he supposed to do? Accept that his son was going to die and there was nothing anyone could do? Or try the one thing, the only thing, that promised even a chance of salvation? Here's where we have to confront something uncomfortable. Who was responsible for what happened to Mercy Brown's body? George Brown made the decision, yes, but Dr. Metcalf performed the autopsy and removal of organs, a trained physician, someone who should have known better, who should have understood that what they were seeing was normal post-mortem preservation, not supernatural life. The selectmen of Exeter gave official permission for the exhumation, lending governmental authority to a folk ritual. The neighbors who gathered to watch and help. They participated, they supported, they enabled. This wasn't one person's superstition. This was community superstition, collective belief. A whole town that looked at a dead girl's preserved body and agreed that the only explanation was vampirism and the only solution was desecration. And we can sit here, over a century later, with our understanding of bacteria and disease, transmission and decomposition rates, and call them ignorant. We can condemn them for violating a grave, for cutting into a young woman's body, for burning her heart. We can feel superior in our modern knowledge and our scientific certainty. But ask yourself this: what do we believe now that will seem equally barbaric in 100 years? What practices do we perform? What treatments do we endorse? What things do we do to the dying and the dead that future generations will look at with horror and disgust? Medical history is full of procedures that seemed reasonable at the time: bloodletting, trepanation, lobotomy, that we now recognize as harmful or useless. How certain are we that everything we do today will stand the test of time? The people of Exeter in 1892 believed they were fighting evil with the only weapons available to them. They were wrong about the nature of the evil. It was bacteria, not vampires, but they weren't wrong that evil was destroying their families. And in the absence of any real solution, any real hope, they grasped at whatever explanation made sense within their world. Does that excuse what they did? No, but it might explain it. And explanation, understanding, that's not the same as justification, but it's necessary if we want to judge them fairly. There's one more layer to this story, one more reason why Mercy Brown's case resonates beyond its historical specifics. Bram Stoker's Dracula was published in 1897, just 5 years after Mercy Brown's exhumation. And while there's no direct evidence that Stoker knew about the Rhode Island vampire case, the parallels are impossible to ignore. Both stories feature a young woman transformed after death into something that feeds on the living. Both involve the removal and destruction of the heart as a cure. Both grapple with the tension between old folklore and modern science, between superstition and rationality. But where Stoker's Dracula is fiction, is fantasy, is a gothic horror story meant to thrill and terrify, Mercy Brown's story is real. It happened to a real girl, to a real family, in a real American town. And that's what makes it so much more disturbing than any fictional vampire could ever be. Because the true horror of Mercy Brown's story isn't that vampires exist, they don't. The horror is that ordinary people, good people, people who loved their families and went to church and tried to do right by their neighbors, could convince themselves that cutting open a dead girl's body and burning her heart was an act of compassion. That's the real darkness here, not the supernatural, but the very human capacity for delusion in the face of unbearable loss. We have very few first. person accounts from people who were present at the exhumation. Most participants, as mentioned, chose silence. But there are a few fragments, recorded years later, that give us glimpses into how they processed what they'd done. A woman named Patience Tucker, not present at the exhumation, but a resident of Exeter at the time, was interviewed in 1935, 3 years after the event. She was in her 70s then, one of the few surviving residents who remembered the incident clearly. Her account is preserved in a collection of oral histories at the Rhode Island Historical Society. "People want to make it out like we was ignorant," she said. "Like we was backwards folk who didn't know no better, but we knew about doctors, we knew about medicine, we'd tried all that, tried everything, and people kept dying. So when someone said there might be another way, a old way, well, you'd try it too if it was your child." When asked if she thought the exhumation was the right thing to do, she paused for a long time. "Then, I think they was desperate. Desperate people do desperate things. Was it right? I don't know, but I understand it. That's the most I can say." A man named Samuel Potter, who claimed to have helped dig up the coffins, was interviewed by a newspaper in 1940, 50 years after the event. He was 81 years old, and his memory was fragmentary, but certain details stayed sharp. "The smell," he said, "that's what I remember most, not the bodies. I didn't look too close at them, but the smell when we opened that tomb, like cold and stone and something else, something wrong, and when they burned. The heart, I was downwind of that fire, and I had to walk away. Couldn't stomach it." Asked if he believed Mercy Brown had been a vampire, he shook his head. "No, but I believed George Brown believed it, and I believed he was trying to save his boy the only way he knew how. So I helped, wouldn't do it again, knowing what I know now, but at the time it made sense." Interest in the Mercy Brown case has waxed and waned over the decades, but it's never completely disappeared. Folklorists in particular have been fascinated by it, as an example of folk belief surviving into the age of science. The case has been studied, written about, analyzed from multiple perspectives. In 2004, a team from Brown University, the irony of the university's name is not lost on anyone, conducted a detailed historical and epidemiological analysis of the case. They obtained access to medical records, death certificates, and cemetery documents. They interviewed descendants of the Brown family and other Exeter residents. They consulted with experts in tuberculosis and decomposition science. Their findings confirmed what most historians had already suspected. The Brown family was caught in a typical pattern of household tuberculosis transmission. Mary Eliza was likely the index case, the first person infected, possibly from someone outside the family. She infected her children before dying. Mary Olive infected her siblings. By the time Mercy died, Edwin was already in the advanced stages of the disease, already doomed. The liquid blood in Mercy's heart was explained as post-mortem lividity combined with cold temperature preservation. The lack of decomposition was entirely consistent with a body stored at near freezing temperatures for 2 months. Every sign of vampirism had a perfectly mundane explanation. But the Brown University team also made a point of noting something important in their published paper. While the scientific explanations for the observed phenomena are straightforward, dismissing the participants' beliefs as mere ignorance fails to account for the complex interplay of grief, community cohesion, and pre-modern medical understanding that characterized rural New England in late 19th century. The exhumation of Mercy Brown should be understood not as an act of ignorance, but as an act of desperation within a specific cultural and historical context. In other words, they were wrong, but we shouldn't judge them too harshly for being wrong. Exeter survived the scandal, though it never quite recovered its obscurity. For years afterward, residents complained about curiosity seekers and journalists coming to town to see the vampire cemetery and interview the superstitious villagers. This outside attention created a siege mentality, a sense that the town was being judged and mocked by outsiders who didn't understand what they'd been through. Some families left, not immediately, but gradually over the following decades, as young people grew up and decided they didn't want to live in the town that had become nationally known for digging up a dead girl and burning her heart. Exeter's population, never large, continued to shrink, but the town also changed in more subtle ways. Church attendance increased. Some historians have suggested that residents doubled down on conventional Christianity as a way of distancing themselves from the pagan, vampire ritual. There was a push for modernization, better roads, more connections to Providence and other cities, anything that would make Exeter seem less isolated and backwards. And there was silence, a collective decision, never formally made but understood by everyone, that the less said about the Brown case, the better. Children who asked about it were told it was old history, nothing to worry about. Families who had participated in the exhumation changed the subject when it came up. For decades, the official position of Exeter seemed to be that if they ignored the story long enough, it would go away. It didn't go away, it couldn't. Because by making Mercy Brown's exhumation a community event, by allowing newspapers to cover it, by leaving documentary evidence in death certificates and town records and newspaper archives, Exeter had ensured that the story would survive, would outlive all the participants, would become, eventually, the one thing the town is known for. Today, Exeter has embraced its dark history to some degree. The town acknowledges the Brown case, includes it in local history materials, and has even placed a historical marker near the cemetery. But there's still discomfort, still a sense that this is not the legacy anyone would choose. Which brings us to an uncomfortable question. What are we doing right now? By telling this story, by examining it in detail, by recreating the events of March 17, 1890. 2. Are we honoring Mercy Brown or exploiting her? She never asked to be famous. She never consented to have her story told and retold across more than a century. She was a girl who died young of a terrible disease, whose body was violated after death, and who has now been transformed into a legend, a curiosity, a cautionary tale. Every retelling of her story is, in some sense, another exhumation, another opening of the coffin, another examination of what should have been left at rest. And yet, there's value in remembering, in understanding, in refusing to let the past be forgotten just because it's uncomfortable. Mercy Brown's story isn't just about vampires or superstition, it's about how communities respond to crisis, about the limits of knowledge, about the terrible things that can happen when fear and grief override reason. If we tell her story with respect, if we remember her as a person and not just a plot point, if we use her case to understand something true about human nature and history, then maybe we're doing something worthwhile. But if we're just using her suffering for entertainment, if we're turning her tragedy into content, if we're exploiting her memory for views and clicks, then we're no better than the newspapers in 1890, who sensationalized her exhumation for profit. The line between education and exploitation, between remembrance and violation, is thin. I hope we're on the right side of it. I hope Mercy Brown, wherever she is, would understand what we're trying to do here. There's a bitter coda to this story. Just 29 years after Mercy Brown died, just 27 years after her heart was burned, in 1920, Albert Comet and Camille Guérin developed the BCG vaccine against tuberculosis. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. In 1943, Selman Waxman discovered streptomycin, the first effective antibiotic against tuberculosis. By 1952, isoniazid had been developed. By the 1960s, tuberculosis was considered a treatable disease, its death rate plummeting. Mercy Brown died in 1892. If she had been born just 50 years later, she probably would have survived. The disease that killed her entire family, that destroyed her body after death, that turned her into a legend, it became curable. Not ancient history, not distant future. Within living memory of people who knew Mercy Brown, tuberculosis went from death sentence to treatable condition. And that makes the whole story even more heartbreaking, because it means the Brown family was so close, so desperately, tragically close to a world where their suffering would have been unnecessary, where consumption would have been just an illness, not a death curse, where a father wouldn't have felt driven to dig up his daughter's body in a last, desperate attempt to save his son. 50 years, that's all it would have taken. 50 years earlier, and the microscope technology needed to identify Mycobacterium tuberculosis wouldn't have existed. 50 years later, and the antibiotics to cure it would have. But the Browns lived in the narrow window between when doctors could identify the disease but not cure it, when science could explain what was happening but not stop it, when knowledge existed to prove vampirism was superstition but not to provide any alternative that worked. Timing, that's what killed the Browns. Not vampires, not curses, just the terrible timing of being born in the wrong era, in the wrong place, too late for ignorance to be bliss, and too early for knowledge to save them. Mercy Brown holds a peculiar place in history. She is generally recognized as America's last vampire. After her case received national attention, after the mockery and condemnation from newspapers across the country, the practice of vampire exhumation essentially stopped. There were no more documented cases. The tradition that had persisted for over a century, that had seen dozens of bodies exhumed and desecrated, ended with a 19-year-old girl in Rhode Island. Why did it end? Partly because of the publicity. The Brown case made vampire exhumation seem backwards and ignorant in a way that previous cases hadn't. It happened late enough in the progress of scientific medicine that the newspapers could definitively state this is superstition, rather than this is a folk remedy of questionable value. It became, in the national consciousness, a symbol of everything modern America was supposed to have moved beyond. But it also ended because it didn't work. Edwin Brown drank the ashes of his sister's heart and died anyway. The ritual failed in the most public, documented way possible. And when the cure fails so spectacularly, when the magic doesn't work, people stop believing in the magic. So Mercy Brown became the last, the final victim of a belief system that was already dying, killed by the same forces of modernization that would eventually cure the disease that killed her. She stands at the end of something, the end of vampire belief in America, the end of folk medical practice in the face of scientific medicine, the end of an era when communities could collectively decide to dig up the dead and call it healing. She's the last vampire because after her, we didn't need vampires anymore. We had bacteria. We had science. We had, eventually, antibiotics. We had real answers to the question of why consumption ran in families, why the young died before the old, why some bodies decayed faster than others. We had answers. They came too late for the Browns, but they came. And yet, despite all our modern knowledge, despite our understanding of decomposition and disease transmission, and the scientific explanations for everything that happened, Mercy Brown won't rest. Locals in Exeter report strange experiences at Chestnut Hill Cemetery. lights seen near her grave at night, the sound of a young woman coughing, a feeling of overwhelming sadness in the area where the receiving tomb once stood, electronic devices that malfunction near her headstone, photographs that develop with strange shadows or orbs or blurs exactly where her grave is located. Are these experiences real? Are they evidence of something supernatural? Or are they the power of suggestion, the human brain's tendency to find patterns and meaning in random phenomena, the weight of knowing what happened in this place creating experiences that seem paranormal but are actually psychological? It doesn't matter, because whether the hauntings are literally real or psychologically real, they serve the same purpose. They keep Mercy Brown from being forgotten. They ensure that her story continues to be told, that people continue to visit her grave, that we continue to grapple with the questions her case raises about desperation and dignity and the thin line between love and desecration. Maybe that's the real haunting, not a ghost, but a story that won't die, a violation that won't be buried, a girl who wanted only to rest, but who will never be allowed to, because what happened to her is too important, too terrible, too revealing about human nature to let fade into obscurity. Mercy Brown is doomed to be America's last vampire forever, her name invoked in books and documentaries and articles, and yes, videos like this one, examined and re-examined, her tragedy picked over like bones in a grave, never allowed to simply be a daughter who died too young and was loved too much. So we return to the question we started with. Where is the line between love and desecration? When does trying to save a child become violating the dead? George Brown loved his children, that's not in question. He watched his wife die, then his eldest daughter, then his youngest daughter, and he was watching his only son die. And someone told him there was a way to stop it, a way to break the curse, to save Edwin, to finally keep death from taking everything he had left in the world. Was it love that made him agree to the exhumation, or was it grief? Was it desperate hope? Or was it the surrendering of reason to fear, the abandoning of his daughter's dignity in a last attempt to save his son? Could he have said no? Could he have chosen to let Edwin die with Mercy's body undisturbed, accepting that there was no cure, no hope, no magic that would change what was happening? Should he have? Was it braver to try anything, no matter how barbaric, or would it have been braver to accept the unacceptable, to endure the unendurable, to face death without desecrating the already dead? These aren't rhetorical questions. These are real moral dilemmas that don't have clear answers, because on one hand, violating a corpse is wrong. Cutting into the body of a dead 19-year-old girl, removing her organs, burning them, that's wrong by any modern ethical standard, wrong by any religious teaching, wrong by simple human decency. But on the other hand, letting your child die when you believe there's something you could try, is that also wrong? Is it moral to choose the dignity of the dead over the possible salvation of the living? Would any of us, truly, watching our child waste away, being offered one last desperate option, have the strength to say no? The comfortable answer is to say that George Brown should have known better, that an educated person in 1890, too, should have understood that vampirism wasn't real, that Dr. Metcalf particularly should have stopped the whole thing. The comfortable answer lets us feel superior, lets us believe we would have made different choices, better choices. But the honest answer is that we don't know. We don't know what we would do in that farmhouse, in that winter, watching the last of our children cough blood into a handkerchief. We don't know whether our love would be strong enough to resist the pull of desperate action, whether our reason would override our grief, whether we would have the courage to do nothing when doing something, even something terrible, felt like the only option. And maybe that's the real horror of Mercy Brown's story. Not that it could happen, but that it could happen to anyone. That any of us, given the right circumstances, the right pressures, the right losses, might find ourselves standing in a cemetery in March, watching someone we love be cut open, telling ourselves, it's for a greater good, performing an atrocity and calling it salvation. The story of Mercy Lena Brown remains one of the most haunting cases in American folklore, not because of what happened, but because of what it reveals about the distance between love and horror, between reason and desperation, between the modern world and the darkness that lurks just beneath its surface. 134 years have passed since that March morning when a Rhode Island community opened a tomb and cut out a dead girl's heart. We have antibiotics now. We have vaccines. We understand bacteria and contagion and decomposition. We have driven vampire belief so far to the margins of culture that it exists only in fiction, in entertainment, in stories we consume for fun because we absolutely know, that vampires aren't real, and yet the questions Mercy Brown's case raises have no expiration date. The questions about how far we'll go for the people we love, about when tradition becomes atrocity, about whether good intentions can excuse terrible actions, about what we're willing to destroy in the desperate hope of saving something else. These questions don't belong to 1892. They belong to every era, every culture, every person who has ever faced the unbearable and had to decide how to bear it anyway. But questions remain, questions that haunt like smoke from a fire that burned a young woman's heart to ashes. What happened to the ashes after Edwin drank them? Were the remainder buried, scattered, saved? No record tells us. Did George Brown ever regret what he did, or did he die believing he had tried his best? His silence gives us no answer. And perhaps most disturbing, how many other Mercy Browns were there, cases that weren't documented, families that exhumed and burned in secret, violations that left no newspaper trail, no historical record, just bones disturbed in darkness, and rituals performed where no one would report them. Perhaps these questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is part of the legacy, part of the haunting, part of what makes this story more than just history. To this day, visitors to Chestnut Hill Cemetery report feelings of overwhelming sadness near Mercy Brown's grave. Items left there, flowers, coins, notes, sometimes disappear, sometimes reappear in different arrangements. Photographs often develop with anomalies. The rational explanation is wind, animals, chance, pareidolia, the human tendency to find meaning in randomness. But some know better. Some understand that certain violations leave scars that don't heal, that some stories embed themselves in the land and the air and the collective memory so deeply that they never truly fade. Mercy Brown's story is carved into that cemetery like her name, is carved into her headstone, permanent, enduring, impossible to erase no matter how much time passes or how much we wish we could forget. And on cold March mornings in Exeter, when the last snow is melting and the ground is just beginning to thaw, when the light hits the cemetery at exactly the angle it would have hit on March 17th, 1892, people still report hearing something, not screaming, not wailing. Just the soft, persistent sound of a young woman coughing, the sound of consumption, the sound of death, the sound of a girl who wanted only to rest but who has become instead a symbol, a legend, a warning, a question that has no answer. Most dismiss it as wind through the trees, as imagination, as the mind playing tricks in a place weighted with dark history. But some know better. If this journey through the last vampire panic in American history resonated with you, if you find yourself lying awake tonight pondering the terrible arithmetic of loss, whether any violation can be justified by love, whether any desecration can be excused by desperation, then this channel has more uncomfortable truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the questions that history buries but never answers. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than entertainment, if it made you question how far you would go, what lines you would cross, what you would be willing to destroy to save someone you love. And in the comments, I want to know, if you were George Brown standing in that cemetery, watching your last child die, being offered one desperate chance that required violating your daughter's body, what would you have done? Would you have said yes, like he did? Would you have found the strength to say no? Or would you have stood there, paralyzed between love and horror, between desperation and dignity, unable to choose because both choices are unbearable? Tell me, because understanding what we would do in the darkness, that's how we learn what we truly are. Until next time, remember the most terrifying stories aren't about monsters that don't exist. They're about the monstrous things that ordinary people do when they're pushed too far, when they're hurt too deeply, when they love too much to let go. The darkness we fear in stories is nothing compared to the darkness we carry in ourselves, waiting for the right crisis to let it loose. And sometimes, the only thing more frightening than looking into that darkness is recognizing our own reflection staring back.